Then we saw that chimney and the smoke coming out of it. We had no idea what was going on, but we could smell the stench of that smoke as we walked along. And then we heard somebody say, "That's a crematorium." It was so depressing. It just made me feel as if it was the end of the world. It was the end of our world. How could people be so cruel, so savage, so brutal?
In the chimneys that this Buchenwald survivor remembers, tens of thousands of innocent people burned, losing their lives in a brutal way. In that infamous extermination camp, SS officers found especially sadistic ways to finish off their prisoners. A room designed to deceive them with promises of freedom and shoot them in the neck at the moment they least expected it, thus eliminating thousands of people as if they were animals. In this new installment of military history, we want to tell you about the dark events that took place in those execution rooms and how many people succumbed there. Genickschussanlage is a complicated word in German whose meaning is terrifying. Establishment for shooting in the neck. That was the official name of one of the most infamous and brutal execution systems that operated in the Third Reich, mainly between 1941 and 1942, in the context of its campaign to exterminate undesirable people in accordance with Hitler's policy. As its name suggests, it was a space for the murder of prisoners using similar mechanisms to those used on cattle. Basically, a bullet hit the back of the victim's skull, right between the vertebrae and the arteries, causing immediate collapse. At the time, such cruelty was unthinkable for Jews. Survivors of that dark time remember how, at first, they were unsure of the nature of the detentions. Were they for relocation, for forced labor, or for something worse?
Dinge, an die man glaubt, die gibt man nicht so schnell auf. Wir waren lange der Meinung, dass das, was da geschieht, etwas ist, was mit den Verantwortlichen eigentlich gar nichts zu tun hat.
The darkest thing about the Genickschussanlage is that many of the people did not even know that they were going to be killed. They were taken to these facilities under the lie that they would undergo medical examinations to prepare them for eventual release in countries controlled by the Allies. Once there, they were told to take off their clothes and get into a position that exposed the back of the neck, the ideal place to shoot and destroy brain matter. To maintain the deception until the last moment, the execution areas were furnished as if they were medical offices, with some stretchers and other devices that prevented the prisoner from suspecting that he was marching to his own death. The Genickschussanlage was not the most widely used method since it was not suitable for the mass killing of thousands of people, but it was one of the preferred methods in the Sachsenhausen extermination camp, as well as in other places where special prisoners were held. We are referring to political hostages, Soviet activists, communist leaders, and other people who deserved special treatment. This practice was not only used to carry out death sentences for certain elements who were considered undesirable by the Third Reich. In these shot-in-the-neck establishments, entire families were shot to death, who entered dreaming of being free again and left with white eyes, already lifeless. For example, in the Buchenwald concentration camp, one of these execution spaces was put into service from 1941, mainly to eliminate Soviet prisoners who had fallen into the hands of the Third Reich. As you know, members of the Red Army were among the favorite victims of SS officers. There was a very strong hatred between both sides that was reflected in inhuman and illegal practices, such as cold-blooded shooting. Many of the first Buchenwald captives were political prisoners. In 1938, after the attack on Jewish businesses and families known as the Night of Broken Glass, the SS and the German police sent almost 10,000 Jews to this detention center, where they were subjected to extraordinarily cruel treatment. 600 prisoners died between November 1938 and February 1939. But before we continue, let's talk a little about this infamous place, since it was one of the extermination centers where this murder strategy was most used.
The SS intensified their ruthless and brutal campaign of terror, and 163 deaths were reported in just 4 weeks.
Buchenwald was one of the largest concentration camps established by the Third Reich, as well as one of the first to exist. The initial sections were built in 1937, 2 years before the start of World War II, using land near a wooded area on the northern slope of the Ettersberg. It was located about 8 kilometers northwest of Weimar in central eastern Germany. Before the Nazis took over the area, the territory was best known as the homeland of artists, such as the writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. In addition, the community was also referred to as the birthplace of German constitutional democracy, as the Weimar Republic was established there in 1919. Unfortunately, World War II cast a black and bloody pall over the area, which historians continue to study. Buchenwald was finally opened as a detention center for male prisoners in July 1937, and the first political dissidents persecuted by Nazi Germany were transported there. The first major change occurred in 1938 after the aforementioned Kristallnacht attack on Jews. It was then that Buchenwald was expanded to accommodate some 10,000 people of Jewish descent who had been imprisoned by Adolf Hitler's government. Women were not part of the Buchenwald camp system until 1944, when the war was well underway and more space was needed to house the captured prisoners for later annihilation. Since the late 1930s, inmates were confined to the northern part of the camp, in an area known as the main camp, while the SS guards barracks and the administrative compound were located in the southern part. This was where the sergeants and officers worked and rested, turning the lives of the inmates into hell on earth through beatings, torture, and mind games. The main camp was surrounded by an electrified barbed wire fence, towers, and a chain of sentries equipped with automatically activated machine guns. It was impossible to escape the perimeter alive.
On the 13th of November, a small grey-haired man was found dead on the ground with terrified, open, staring eyes. He had clearly been electrocuted by the electric fence running around the perimeter wall.
On the other hand, the main prison where the prisoners were housed, also known as the bunker, was located at the entrance to the central sector. Taking advantage of some pre-existing structures such as stables and warehouses surrounding the cells, SS officers carried out mass murders. Little by little, the method of shooting the victims in the neck began to be used systematically to reduce the population that had no use for work. The elderly, children, women, and the sick were the main targets of this purge. In 1941, a program of various medical experiments was carried out in Buchenwald in special barracks located in the northern part of the main camp. The infamous Dr. Josef Mengele in Auschwitz, the health experts of the Third Reich took advantage of the thousands of bodies available to analyze the effects of all kinds of viruses and contagious diseases. Among the plagues with which they infected the prisoners was typhus, which resulted in hundreds of painful deaths. The sick people were not treated at all, they were simply left to suffer long agonies until their organs failed. In 1944, SS Dr. Karl Vernet began a series of experiments that he claimed would cure homosexual prisoners, and this involved performing genital surgeries and other types of implants that today sound like pure sadism and bloodlust. One detail that is often overlooked when talking about the perverted medical science that was carried out at Buchenwald is that several rooms in the camp had been loaned to German pharmaceutical companies, who took advantage of the situation to test new drugs on subjects who could not resist. Much of the German industrial sector supported the genocide of millions of people, and its role in these war crimes was too great to ignore. As for society, although the details of what happened to those who were detained were not known, it was clear that there was a racial policy that excluded and criminalized hundreds of thousands of individuals. It is time to return to the situation of the Russian prisoners who were transferred to Buchenwald. These prisoners arrived from other camps focused on forced labor. Initially, they were told that they were being organized to form a new gang that would operate in one of the stables. But the reality is that this place was being reconditioned to be a slaughterhouse for human beings.
In September 1941, the first group of Russian POWs were brought to the camp. The sound of rifle shots from the execution squads behind the closed stable doors was drowned out by loud gramophone music.
The Soviets entered one by one and were told to stand with their backs against the wall so that their measurements could be taken. Behind them were several holes at the height of the neck, so that when the prisoner leaned against them, a soldier on the other side waited for the right moment to blow his brains out. The bullet passed through the neck of the person without any problem, eliminating them instantly. To hide the stains resulting from such carnage, and to prevent suspicion from the new prisoners, the floor was painted brown, a color similar to that of dried blood. These brutal murders were carried out by a special group known as Commando 99, the internal name given to this squad made up of members of the army, and the SS-99 was not a number with symbolic importance. It simply referred to the particular area code of the telephone that operated inside the horse stable. No one wanted to dial those two numbers, which would put them through to the infamous Neckshot Murder Center. As we mentioned, the vast majority of Commando 99's executions were carried out against Red Army soldiers, but they were not the only ones to experience the pain of the captive bolt. Political activists, Orthodox Jews, intellectuals, writers, philosophers, former state officials of the Communist Party, and even economists from the Soviet Union were also on the extermination list. The basis for all these actions were the documents known as Operational Order Number 8 and Number 9, which were presented by the Reich Central Security Office. These files specified how to proceed and who were the ideal subjects for the extermination process. Despite having the official signature and being part of the German plan to deal with the enemy, these guidelines went against international law, since the execution of prisoners is one of the worst war crimes that can be committed. Let's see how the system worked to dispose of the unfortunate victims later.
The ovens gave the crematorium a maximum disposal capacity of about 400 bodies per 10-hour day. Gold-filled teeth were extracted from the corpses before they were incinerated. The coke-fired ovens were made by a company which normally manufactured baker's ovens. The firm's name is clearly inscribed.
From 1943, when the World War intensified and the influx of prisoners to the site increased, Commando 99 had to incorporate a new method into its dark repertoire. The group carried out strangulations with specially placed wall hooks in the basement of the crematorium. This location facilitated the transport of lifeless bodies to the ovens, where hundreds of innocent people were cremated daily. According to the statement of a Buchenwald survivor, the head of Commando 99 was Wolfgang Otto, an unscrupulous man with absolute authority over everything that happened there. Because of his involvement in the murder of Ernst Thälmann and several other important figures, he was one of the first to be caught by the Allies. After the Second World War, Otto, along with SS officers such as Max Schobert, were tried in the Buchenwald trial for their crimes as members of the execution squad. All of them were found guilty of the most horrendous acts of torture, receiving sentences ranging from death, by hanging in the case of Schobert, to long years of imprisonment for Otto and his henchmen. The deceased at Buchenwald presented an enormous challenge to researchers and historians who wanted to reconstruct the horrors of the Second World War. The prisoners brought there were not registered either upon entry or execution, so they were a kind of ghosts. Their passage through the facility was fleeting and ended in a large mass grave without marks or names. In many cases, the ashes of dozens of people were mixed and discarded as if they were garbage and not the remains of a human being who had just died. The aim was to cover them with a sepulchral and gloomy oblivion in order to keep the Holocaust a secret for as long as possible. It is estimated that some 8,000 people were executed at the Genickschussanlage in Buchenwald.
This was a rapid and quick execution, and the body of the prisoner would then be taken out a different exit, away from the eyes of the others. They were then taken to the camp's crematoria, where they were burned quickly.
Unfortunately, as we anticipated, this was not the only location where these infamous methods were used. Let's take a look at the Mauthausen concentration and killing camp. In the strict sense of the word, it was not an extermination center, but a group of complexes that operated simultaneously under the same leadership. These brutal establishments were located around a small quarry located in the city of Mauthausen, Austria, about 20 kilometers from Linz. Initially, there was only one sector for all activities. Over time, it expanded to become one of the largest complexes in the Nazi zone of Europe. Apart from the 4 subcamps that operated in Mauthausen and the nearby community of Gusen, there were another 50 establishments spread throughout Austria and southern Germany, where prisoners were exploited as slaves. In Mauthausen, the murderers also used their creativity to deceive the prisoners until the moment before their death. In a series of underground rooms located in the aforementioned extermination camp, SS officers built a room that imitated a photography studio. To give more realism to the context, they hung pictures and various optical devices on the walls. The prisoners were taken there with the order to take a photo of them to prepare a document necessary to return to freedom. People went there happily, dazzled by the possibility of escaping from this hell alive. The subjects were placed on a wall in front of a tripod, with a camera on top. On the floor, there were exact marks indicating to the prisoner where he should stand, so that the photograph would come out in the best possible way. However, there was no flash. What was heard was the shot of a pistol. At that moment, a bullet passed through the vertebrae and the brain of a poor unfortunate who had been chosen as a prisoner on that day. This is how thousands of people died, deceived by a sadistic joke made by their captors. Hidden behind sheets were the Sonderkommando, teams made up of well-behaved prisoners who received some benefits in exchange for dispatching the corpses of the murdered people. Not only did they have to dispose of the lifeless body, but they also had to clean up the mess caused by the gun. The hole in the back of the neck caused a lot of bleeding, so pools of red liquid were a frequent sight in the basement of Mauthausen. The Third Reich knew how to create an internal climate in which enemies were not perceived as human, but as waste of flesh and blood that had to be eliminated immediately, especially if they were Jews, gypsies, citizens of the Balkans, or worse still, Russians belonging to the Red Army. The order that came down from Adolf Hitler's very office was that all these elements had to be executed without the need for a judicial process. They were undesirable and had to be treated that way. Of course, the men who carried out these orders knew full well that they were committing a grotesque war crime, which is why once the war was over, they did everything possible to hide their sins. However, the blood always ends up coming to light, thanks to the testimonies of survivors like Marcia Kreutzmann.
Talked by the German that we will be all burned in the crematorium. If the American army come 12 o'clock, 5 to 12, they will manage to burn us.
As the Allied forces approached, the SS dismantled the various execution posts, known as Genickschussanlage. Since these were stables converted into medical offices, all that was needed was to remove the furniture and destroy the wooden structures. This is how the officers tried to cover their own tracks, not expecting that thousands of survivors would return home to tell the truth and accuse those responsible for such torment. New stories and accounts continue to emerge about the horrendous mechanisms used by the Third Reich to annihilate its prisoners. Almost 80 years after the end of the Second World War, it is still incomprehensible that a government was capable of acts of such brutality as the execution of people with guns to kill cattle. What elevates this practice to unsuspected levels of darkness is the prior deception. Those lies told by the SS officers, seconds before pulling the trigger to destroy the brains of their prey. These decisions reveal the pleasure they felt when ending a life. In this way, we come to the end of a video full of brutality and pain. If you like this content and want to continue discovering the hardest stories that were experienced in the Second World War, we invite you to subscribe and activate the notifications of this channel. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.